Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and on this week's podcast, I have a very special guest, a guest you've never heard on my show before, David Thompson. How you doing, David?
I'm good. Yeah, first time ever. First time. How are
There's
you?
a first. I'm great, and I'm so happy to have you on. And just as there's a first time for everything, there is a first time to talk about a new game, which is what we're doing here. So David's going to tell us about a game that's in development that no one has heard about before, for real. So tell us about Fifth Platoon.
Yeah, so Fifth Platoon, it is at the very beginning, sort of the conceptualization stage. And this is a game that is essentially a homage to the African-American soldiers who fought in World War II as part of integrated platoons. So this isn't a story that is super well known, but late in the war in the European theater of operations, African-Americans were integrated into existing divisions. And again, yeah, so basically most of the platoon was consisted of African-Americans. There were a few, white guys or whatever in it. But yeah, this is a story that's all about, them and just paying homage to their contribution.
And if I recall correctly, this game was inspired actually by some controversy over the art for Undaunted Normandy. Could you tell us some more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when Undaunted, so after myself and Trevor Benjamin, the co-designer, after we had designed it and Osprey had published it, they went to Roland McDonald, who's the artist, and he came back with the initial sort of concept art. And one thing we noticed was, hey, so some of the depictions for the U.S. side include African-American soldiers. And so, I said, hey, just so you guys are tracking, this game is about the 30th Infantry Division, which was an all-white division. There were no integrated platoons at any point ever in that division. And we had a conversation. Are we comfortable with it? It's ahistoric. But it's inclusive, and that's what we all thought was more important, right? So we wanted the depiction of the soldiers in the game to be inclusive. So yeah, that was something we even referenced it vaguely, sort of in the rules, right? There's a quick passage at the beginning of the rule book that talks about, hey, some of the soldiers in this game are not, necessarily historically accurate in their depiction, something like that. But as you said, that cover, the depiction of African Americans on the box, has caused no shortage of outcry amongst, I guess would-be Undaunted players. It led ultimately, I wrote an article in C3I magazine about Undaunted, and I put an entire section about that decision and the truth about, the integrated platoons and the African American representation in World War II. And the thing that really bothers me about that argument, about the people who raised a huge problem with the cover, was never did anybody. I want to think about this for a second because I want to be hyperbolic here, but I don't think I ever saw one instance of somebody saying this box is problematic. It's ahistoric because the 30th Infantry Division never had an integrated platoon, or this box is problematic. This cover is problematic because the integrated platoons didn't exist during the time when the U.S. was fighting in Normandy, right? Either of those statements would have been true, right? And they would have been, if you're a person who prizes historicity over all else, that would have been fine, right? Those would have been true statements. But the kind of statements that were made, all you need to do is go to the cover image on Board Game Geek, and you'll see this huge list of a bunch of statements that aren't great. They were just ignorant statements, and when I say ignorant, I mean truly, like as in not informed. Like blacks weren't part of combat units in World War II, or there was never integration in World War II. So I think that's the thing, besides just the clear racism, that's the thing that really bothered me. And I said, okay, look, there's an opportunity to tell a story here that people just don't know about, right?
So how has your research into this been going? I wouldn't even know what sources to start looking at. So where did you start, and where has it led you?
Yeah, there's one sort of critical book on the topic, and it's called Blood for Dignity. That's sort of the starting point, the kind of the path of least resistance starting point. So that is one of the sources like a secondary source I looked at. Now there's some really, once you start digging into it, there's some really good source material, primary source material, just as the war was ending. the army commissioned a study to look at, because this was sort of it was a very controversial thing, right? Integration, and they wanted to assess this sort of test, right? And I mean that's how they viewed it, as a test, and the assessment was very positive, right? Very positive. The integrated units performed very well. There were no, like, because when you go through, assessment of military units in combat, they're assessed for their performance, and there were no units that were assessed as poor. There were a few that were assessed as fair, and everybody else was good or better. And so, just from a pure performance perspective, it was fantastic. Um, there was independently, there was a huge survey that went out to white officers and enlisted troops that interacted with the integrated platoons, and just tons and tons and tons of examples of guys who were openly opposed to it when it started, who said, "Hey, this was fantastic. This worked out super well." There were examples of, within the integrated platoon, the typical thing is the platoon leader would be white, and sometimes the platoon sergeant would be white, right? Less surprising to nobody. But then most of the rest of the platoon was black. But oftentimes, through necessity of war, you would have white guys who were integrated into these platoons. And so there's an example of, like, a white medic who was in a platoon, and they were going to move him out of it, and he refused, right? He was like, "No, this is where I want to be." And so when you have examples of that, like, you can't argue how effective that is. Now, also, probably not surprising to anybody, there was huge concern about this study amongst the military leadership, because they understood the political situation, especially with the South, and at the time, right, there was just no support for that. And so, coming out of World War II, they resegregated those units, unfortunately.
Oh, that's such a bummer.
It's
No.
really, really, really bad. So these units, right? So these guys who were integrated in, they actually segregated them in Europe. They put them back with their former units, and they sent them home, so they were not part of the units that they had fought with. That's how awful it is.
So, how did this history come to light? I mean, was there any active suppression of the studies, or what had happened? Is this the sort of thing that, you can't go home and talk about it because they sent you home as part of a different unit to, like, make everything look like it never happened? I'm sort of curious about this now that you said it.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I don't know. I don't know what the classification of the 1945 study was, the one I was referring to. It probably was at least, like, limited distribution to the leadership that was making decisions based on it. Now, I guess if there's a silver lining to it, it didn't take long, right? Like 1948 is when the official, like, Truman's policies came out, and integration officially began, and then like all things, like, necessity leads to change, right? So the Korean War started, and we had to have people fight in the Korean War. So, hey, let's reintegrate. And so you're really only talking about a period of about 3 to 5 years after World War II, where we actually start to see true integration. But I can tell you an example, and this is, I don't have the quotes, but I can point you towards a god awful study that was done around the time of World War I, where there are quotes in it that I would be embarrassed to even read to you about the U.S. Army's assessment of the contribution of African Americans to World War I, and why they should not be used in subsequent wars, right? And it's all of the hyper racist, sort of stereotypical stuff you could imagine. And that report was classified, I think, secret at the time it was written, so that specifically designed to be limited in distribution.
Interesting. So, mechanically speaking, have you gotten very far with this game? Is it going to be something that is more like Undaunted? Are you looking at something that's more like one of your Valiant Defense games? Or is it something totally different?
Yeah, it's a good question. One thing about this game. So I was listening to, and this is going to be a little bit of a tangent, but we'll get there. I was listening to a discussion recently, and I can't remember who it was. It might have been a discussion on Jason Perez's Shelf Stories, where the discussion of the game Freedom, the Underground Railroad, which I know I love very much, it came up, and I because of who I am and, all my life sort of baggage and background, had never really considered the fact that in Freedom, I mean, obviously you're playing people who are helping the Underground Railroad, but you're not, the slaves themselves have no agency, right?
Right.
And so, I went, once I kind of realized that and thought about it, I was like, that's really interesting. And I definitely don't want this game to be that. And so if you think about Undaunted, you're explicitly taking the role of the platoon commander, right? And so I thought, well, guess what this game is not going to be? It's not going to be you playing these integrated platoons and being the white lieutenant who's in charge of the integrated platoon. That's just not right. I think what I would like to do with it is make it a solitaire or co-op game where you're taking the role of the individual squad leaders, right? And so you're commanding the squad under your your control. And I wanted it to be. I mean, I don't obviously I don't have a desire to design super similar games, so I wanted to be different both than Valiant Defense and Undaunted. And I think that the co-op nature of the game is something just from a purely mechanical perspective is what I'll try to focus primarily on.
Right. So maybe instead of it being, one, I guess I'm trying to think about it. I still think about it in terms of your other games because that's what I have, right? But in this case, it might be two people kind of maneuvering over a map and carrying stuff out in coordination with each other.
Yeah. So I will tell you now. It's a huge caveat, right? And you know this because you know how I work. So I usually do about a year of research. And then after that, I do all the sort of modeling of the game. And then I start doing the game design itself. So I'm very much in that research stage. So like all of this is hyper subject to change. But what I'm thinking is, how can a game support true solo and co-op and feel, true to both of those? I'm thinking that each player takes the role of a squad leader. And if you're playing a scenario as just a single squad leader with your squad, you're playing literally just the spatially represented portion of your squad. But if you're playing with other players, then you would actually enlarge the play area. And so you would actually envision the full extent of where all the other squads are. And like you're saying, you would have the squads maneuvering around each other, etc. Right? So that's kind of what I'm envisioning right now.
Interesting. Actually, it's funny you should say that because that makes me think of Spirit Island. And Spirit Island is another one of those games that I love the theme very much, but also the Dahan have no agency.
Right.
Because you're playing the spirits. Huh. But what would it be if the Dahan were moving around the map and got assistance occasionally? That would be a really different game. So, kind of back to talking about, you're in the research phase for your game, and, you haven't started designing the mechanisms yet exactly, but there are other reasons for that as well. And one of them is that you are looking for a cultural consultant or a co-designer to work with you on the project. So could you say some more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you and I recently had a discussion during the San Diego Historical Convention, right, where the topic of the discussion was sort of like difficult or tough game sort of topics, right? And we had some interesting discussions during that where it was myself, and Volko Runke were talking about this topic of, is it okay for a guy like me, a 42-year-old white guy, to design a game that's about integrated platoons? And I think that, I don't want to speak for him, but I think that Volko and I kind of disagreed a little bit on this because he approaches things, and this is, I'm just generically speaking, more like as an objective model of events, right? And I really, generally speaking, I am trying to evoke some sort of like emotion or what the game means to me. And if the game is about, the 30th Infantry Division, which I based on my grandfather, then cool, I can do that, right? But if the game is about the desperate plight of Polish postmen, then I might want to bring in somebody who's from that place, right? With like soldiers in postmen's uniforms, or crazy Italian naval commandos. I might want to team up with an Italian historian. So that I want to do the same kind of thing here. And so I've got a couple of leads. I'm fortunate that there was recently a thesis written by a Army War College student who he himself is in the military. He's an African American, and so he can speak to what it feels like to be an African American in the military. Now, he can't obviously during the time period that the game is set in, but certainly he's infinitely more qualified to talking about the emotional, importance of that type of event. I've also reached out to, there's a reenactors group in the Northeast that goes by the Fifth Platoon, and they consist of African Americans. They're reenact all sorts of different things, but obviously the reference to the Fifth Platoon is the exact same topic. And I've reached out to them because, like I said, they consist of historians. They consist of former military, enlisted and officers. So the goal here is to basically find a person or people who, yes, can speak to the historical accuracy, which is super important, but also the sort of emotional importance of the topic, right? Because at the end of the day, there's only so much that that I can relate to.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I think that when you are, I think when we talk about things like cultural appropriation, a lot of what the conflict is over is taking stories from other people and telling them and then profiting from them. And so, yeah, an active attempt not to do that would probably be smart. So,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So you said you had leads, which means that you don't necessarily have a partnership established yet. So I guess my question then is what happens? You're doing all this research, you've got these ideas, but what happens if a partnership doesn't occur?
Yeah. So fortunately, I haven't ever had this happen before, right? So I've always been able to team up with people. Interestingly, in the past, I've teamed up with people who were at least tangentially related, in the board game hobby, right? And so this is the first time that I have gone outside of the hobby to ask. So the answer is I don't know, but I don't think I would be comfortable designing a game and pitching a game to a publisher myself, just by myself on this topic, right? I think that for me to feel truly comfortable and to feel like I'm really doing, justice to it, I feel like I absolutely need somebody that I can look to and say, yes, this person can, speak to the history, cool, but really speak to, as we talked about, sort of the cultural importance of the topic.
So I think that some people would hear that and think like, ooh, oh, you've already put on all this work, you've been doing all of this research, but yeah, I mean, without the consultant, without the buy-in from the community whose story you want to tell, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's a very, when you go down the super personal individual path that I do with games, right? And from like the Valiant Defense series and even Undaunted, but especially the Valiant Defense series, and it's like this. These are real people, right? Undaunted is not real people, right? It's these made up guys, and that's fine. That you can't offend anybody. But I've had tough conversations. So I'll give you an example. I'm working on a game right now that's set in the Battle of the Bulge. It's about an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. It's like 20 guys, and they fought in this little tiny town. Well, guess what? So the leader of the platoon that fought there, he's passed away, but his daughter is alive, and she and I have chatted, and she wasn't super comfortable with me making a game about it. Her words. I reached out to a community where she's that's associated with that platoon, and I said, hey, I'm working on this game, it's about this topic, I need help with trying to find some artifacts from the battle and stuff. And she said, her response was something along the lines of, my father would have never been comfortable with a game being based on this. And that led to she the two of us had a long discussion about it. And I think that I explained, hey, the intent here is not really a game like haha funny game. It's about a simulation, and it's trying to have like an informative and educational tool, much like a movie or a book or whatever. And I think she became comfortable with it. But yeah, the last thing in the world I would ever want to do is design a game about real people and have people be grossed out or uncomfortable or.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And actually leads me to another question. I was just thinking about it while you were saying it, which is okay, if you had not been able to explain yourself and kind of get buy in from this woman, from the community that she's a part of, again, would you axe the Battle of the Bulge game as
Yeah,
well in the same way?
it's funny. I had to go through that process of deciding about that early on. When she said that, I sat there and I spent a lot of time anguishing over it. And the answer is yes. I had decided, okay, well, if she's not comfortable, if there's a family member who had a relative that fought in this battle and they're not comfortable with it, then I'm not going to make this game. That's just disrespectful, and I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, which also leads to the next question, right? Which is, okay, at what point can you no longer call something disrespect? Actually, this is also something I think about as like an ancient historian too, right? At what point is an artifact an antiquity?
Sure.
When does something stop being family memorabilia and belong in a museum?
Right. Yeah.
And like, where is the line on that? I feel like direct living descendants, how far back do you go? A daughter absolutely makes a lot of sense to me.
Right.
But like, what if we're talking about great grandkids? What if we're talking about great 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 grandkids? Like, at what point are you allowed to make the historical commentary you want to make, regardless of personal feelings on the matter? And I
Yeah.
wonder about this a lot. Like, I study societies that no longer exist, but I mean, people have used Rome for a number of purposes and feel different kinds of attachments to it. Whose attachment is correct?
Yeah, I think that like everything else, it's all personal, right? It has to be, right? Because there could be people. It's not if this. Let's just carry on with this example. If I had been designing the game and she said that, it's not wrong for me to say, well, cool. It's okay that you feel that way, but I'm still going to make the game. That doesn't make me wrong, right? It's just a personal decision. And
Right.
and similarly, if you know you're working on something about ancient Rome and somebody's like, hey, the way you've, I mean, well, let's take your gladiatorial series of that you're working on right now, right? Like, so
Yeah.
if somebody is super offended by the inaccuracies of the way in which gladiators are represented typically, you might say like, oh well, I shouldn't make this game, I should change the way I'm designing this game, right? Like,
Right.
clearly it's not offending anybody that lives today. Nobody has any living attachment to that, but
Right. I am merely offended on an intellectual level. No, I'm not offended at all. For those of you who don't know, on my site beyondsolitaire.net, I've been writing like a little article series about the way that we treat gladiator games, and sort of we have a tendency to respond differently in different games to the reality that gladiators were enslaved people. There were some people who chose to fight, but when they made that decision, they also gave up their legal rights. They no longer had full social standing again after having fought as a gladiator. There's a whole lot of complexity to it that we don't always acknowledge because we just want to have fun guys fighting and like enjoy the blood sport without any of the guilt. And so, yeah, I think about this sort of thing a lot in the sense that, as a historian, I care about it just because I think that it's worth knowing the truth about things. But like, does it bother me? No. I mean, I'll throw down in any gladiator game ever just because I know that if I were an ancient Roman, I probably would have also been a bad person who thought that watching people die in the arena was fun. I mean, you grow up in the culture you grow up in, and so I don't take any of it too seriously or get too pearl clutchy about it. But I also think it's something that's really rich to talk about in the context of our world and what we might accidentally be saying about ourselves when we talk about the Romans. And for me, that's what makes historical gaming interesting. But I feel like in your case, you design more modern games, right? So we're not talking about ourselves through people who are far from us. Like, we're still kind of talking about ourselves.
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So I guess the other question then is, right, like, I mean, you work for historical accuracy. It's just part of your ethos. So I take it that you don't necessarily think that that's a requirement for other people, that it's a personal choice.
100%, right? Like, I don't ever. So personally, when I'm playing a game that purports to be like historical, I like for there to be things like design notes and historical context and stuff like that. That's my preference. But certainly, it's totally fine if somebody wants to make a game that's ahistoric. That's it. All that matters to me is that I want the game to have like, it doesn't have to be an obviously stated goal. Like I don't need to open up the rule book and it say the goal of this game was to da 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 da. But I want there to be a purpose to the game, and I want it to be true to its purpose. Right.
Makes sense. Although actually, I think this conversation about historical accuracy also does tie back around to what we're talking about in terms of cultural appropriation and treating difficult topics appropriately, which is, I think that you have to judge games partially on what they say about us and our society now. So like we need to worry when we make things that reveal problems in ourselves, which, is not most games. Like there's nothing problematic about Azul. It's fine. Unless you're trying to eat the pieces. But, like a game that claims to be historical, I have higher expectations of. And I get upset when something is claiming a level of accuracy that then it doesn't have.
Right.
So one game that I'm not going to name it here because I actually think that it was a very well-intentioned game, but they quoted a professor talking about how this is an amazing reflection of true human agency in ancient Rome. But it was a game about betting on gladiator fights. And it made me mildly twitchy because I was like, wait, but so like once you bring a historian in or a professor and you're making claims, then I feel like there's a lot more to say.
Yeah.
But I actually think that that's true. And one of the reasons you need a partner for Fifth Platoon when you are talking about, the emotional impact of a story or something that's like, if you're making a statement about the importance of something like an integrated unit, you as a lone white guy, it's just like a historical game not having the history cred.
I totally agree with you. I mean, yeah. So, let me give you an example of like something that happened. So most of the book that I mentioned, Blood for Dignity, it's by David Colley is the name is the author. If anybody's interested in checking it out. It follows one specific. So for people that are interested in this, there were something like 4,000. So the way this played out, well, let's dive a little bit more into the history because people might find that interesting, right? How this came about. So for people that don't know World War II very well, end of 1944, so the U.S. has been fighting in France and Germany, etc., trying to go into Germany, and we have the Battle of the Bulge. Battle of the Bulge, I think. I'm not going to claim this is accurate. I think that it was like the bloodiest battle for America in history, like the most bloody battle. So we lost tons and tons of people. The United States military needed something like 80,000 new men over a very short period of time to replenish all the people who were lost in the Battle of the Bulge. And so Eisenhower said, hey, we have all of these units in rear echelon service, elements. Let's use that manpower. And Eisenhower said something along the lines of like, black soldiers will not be denied the opportunity to volunteer, something like that. And so it opened up the opportunity. So because up until that point, if you were an African American in the military, you were basically one of two things. You were either in like a rear service type unit, or you were in a all black combat unit, of which there were very few. So black soldiers, so African American soldiers who wanted to be in combat had very little opportunity. So it opened up the door for people to volunteer, and I think there was something like between 4,000 and 5,000 African American volunteers, of which something like a little over 2,000 were selected. So if you think about that, it wound up being 50-ish platoons that were integrated. So we're not talking like it's not huge numbers, but it's also not irrelevant, right? Like it's a fairly substantial number. Okay, so of the 50-ish some platoons that got integrated, the account in Blood for Dignity largely tracks along with a unit that was in the 99th Division. So they were a unit that fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Ironically, and this was not intended, this was not planned, it's the same division that my game Landsworth Ridge, which is about Battle of the Bulge, it's about the same unit. So that's an interesting thing. It's even the same regiment. But regardless, it's about one of the platoons that was integrated into that unit. And so it was a really long way of getting back to what I wanted to point out, which is there's an account where The soldiers are fighting. They're trying to get across a field, and it's really bad. They were caught out in the middle of a field. They're getting mowed down, and an African American soldier, basically, without getting into too gory, gets kind of blown in half, right? And so he's like bleeding out on the field. And there's a white medic who refused to go help him. Now, is that going to be? Am I going to have stuff like that in the game? Probably not, right? Like that's not necessarily the route I'm going. But is it possible for me to ever understand that situation, right, where a black soldier's like, "Hey, my buddy needs help," looks to the white medic, and the white medic refuses? That's ludicrous. That's just I can't relate to that. We can't. So, yeah, just that sort of stuff, right? Like, yeah, it's just impossible. In the same way that I would, like, just like you said, if I said, "Oh, my game's historically accurate," and I just make up a bunch of stuff and there's zero, evidence in it, it would be the exact same thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there are also some topics that you just can't touch because the taint of white supremacy is so strong. And we can cut this, I guess, but actually, do you want to blow the pot up?
Sure.
So, do you want to talk about how we looked at co-designing your most requested Valiant Defense setting?
Oh, yeah,
And
absolutely.
decided not
Yeah.
to?
Let's talk about it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as y'all know, I'm not a game designer, but I know how to find a good partner. So someday, David Thompson, I will design a game.
Well, we won't talk about the other topic that will come about.
No, that's going to happen. So
yeah.
That's a really good topic. But okay, so the most requested that I've seen Valiant Defense game that does not yet exist is the Alamo. Would you say that that's true?
I would say that's. I mean, certainly, if it's not, it's certainly like right up there in the top one or two for sure. But it probably is. It probably is the single most requested Valiant Defense series topic that people have asked for. And so, my time in Texas is limited to Air Force basic training, right? So I am not a Texan, right? So I spent a few weeks there at one point. But you are, so you came into that. I approached you and I said, "Hey, this is routinely talked about." I didn't, without doing the research, right? I was like, I don't know that this would make a great game in the topic. What do you think, right? And that sort of kicked off your investigation.
Yeah, and so I knew I had a feeling in my gut about it. But okay, so for full context, if you grew up in Texas, you take Texas history, you learn all about the Alamo. I remember that when all the state corridors came out, we were all like, why isn't the Alamo in the state corridor in San Antonio? Because everyone thinks about the Alamo when that's where you're from. Like, everybody. I went to Clara Driscoll Middle School. Little did I know that she was a jerk. Okay, so, I started looking into it because I didn't even know if we had good enough information about the battle itself to make a good game. So I just started like looking into who was there and like, is there anything? And then it became clear immediately, like within 5 seconds of Googling, like the first page of hits that, and this is something that I guess I always knew, but I never thought about because it's easy not to when you are white and when you don't have to think about it, frankly, is that, the Alamo is also a center for really weird white supremacist needs in San Antonio. And, we have people in the Texas militia out there with guns, like defending our freedom, defending the Alamo to this very day. And so I did some further research on it. And as it happens, on my birthday this year, an amazing book came out called Forget the Alamo, The True Story of the Myth That Made Texas. And it's by Brian Burrow, Chris Tomlinson, and Jason Stanford. I actually reviewed it at my BookTube channel. I'll put a little thing in the show notes about it. But basically they went back, and the Alamo myth like runs deeper than you could ever imagine. Like, it is entirely possible that Davy Crockett never died at the Alamo at all, escaped and was executed by Santa Anna. The battle itself did not really need to happen, although that part I'd heard before. But just the entire history of myth making about the Alamo is absolutely wild. Like the Davy Crockett Disney thing and like the John Wayne Alamo epic were very much specifically political attempts to promote American values in the face of communism by kind of recasting this Texas battle in ways that were super disrespectful to Tejanos. And also, Tejano participation in the war for Texas independence was there, but it got downplayed over time. The battle itself, we talk about like, oh, the heroes, but they're all white guys, even though there were also Tejanos there, and it's just a mess. Like the story of the Alamo is not an inspiring story if you look at it on the basis of the facts, and it's really not inspiring the way that we're using it. And in fact, this Forget the Alamo book was so incendiary that a museum had invited the authors to give a book talk, and their board, which included, buddies of our Texas governor, shut the talk down. I don't think we can make an Alamo game.
No, and I mean, and what's funny is when I originally talked to you about it, that was kind of that's kind of what I suspected, right?
Yeah.
I think my original question to you was something along the lines, and when we first talked about it, was like, look, the Valiant Defense series is all about you taking on the role of people who are valiantly defending. Like, it implies there's some sort of like, positive qualities, and so that was my suspicion, is that once we started pulling the thread, that we were like, it's not as clear cut as you would want it to be in this game
right.
series, right?
Yeah, I mean, in truth, if making a Valiant Defense series game about the Alamo would be calling people Valiant Defenders who got into a war with Mexico because they wanted the right to keep slaves that they brought into Texas. And actually, the new Mexican government, after they overthrew Spain, wanted to abolish slavery, and that was the beginning of the problem. That's right. Not Valiant. Like,
yep. So there will not be an element.
But, we also thought about trying to see if, okay, well, we knew that it wasn't only Anglo-Texans who were involved in the Alamo. Would it be possible to do this from the point of view of, of Tejanos who were there? Would it be possible to take some sort of different angle on this? And really, there's just not. Like, the battle itself was kind of a mess. And then also the reasons why it was fought were a mess. And it's just a mess.
Right. So this actually, so we've gone full circle, because the answer is, even if we had could have come up with an interesting mechanical game, we would have been sort of lying to ourselves and everybody else about the historicity of the situation, right?
Yeah. Or we would have had to promote something that we didn't want to, values-wise.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, ew. Like, so, when you're making games on difficult subjects, right, part of it is being real with yourself about the history and what you might be promoting accidentally. Like, I think most people who played a game about the Alamo would just be like, wee, Alamo, and they would never think about it. It would never go beyond, this is a fun game, woohoo. But if you're making a historical game, and that's the person that you are, and that's what you're presenting, or I think even any Alamo game at this point, you have to take that into account, because that story has been made to make, Hispanic kids feel horrible in Texas schools for an ungodly number of years now. Like you have to be real with yourself about your source material, even if you want it to be just a game, even if you want it to be fun. Like, there's some things that you just can't justify.
Yeah.
And and then there are things that are more ambiguous. Like, I did a lot of research on this platoon, but I need a partner, which is where you're at with Fifth Platoon. Like, on its face, it's a great topic. I really hope this game comes into an existence, but it has to have the right birth.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, I need to be comfortable with it before it can move on, right?
Yeah, I do think that's also something we don't often talk about too, though, which is that, everybody's got a different comfort level, but you as a designer, I mean, you're making important creative choices that are your historical voice. You're contributing something beyond just, I made a fun game. Like, you're making a statement with what you make.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't want to sound too whatever. Like, it's not, it's at the end of the day, it is still a game, right? But I mean, the point is, like, it's not my job, right? Like, I'm not a professional game designer full time, right? Like, I have a day job, and I want to try to make games that either there needs to be a reason for it. And in this case, in this series, the Valiant Defense series, it needs to be something that I think is an important topic, right? Like, it's actually the goal of the entire series is to pay homage to people. And in this game, I want to be similar to Valiant Defense, right? Like, the point of making the game is because it's an important topic, not because I'm concerned about making money or whatever, right? So I'm privileged in the position that I'm in. So let me take the time and try to do something to pay respect.
Absolutely. So I think this is a good place for a frivolous question, which is what are you playing right now that you're just enjoying, since we've had this
Oh,
like serious combo?
yes. This is a good question. This is a good question. So the answer is I haven't played a whole lot of anything lately except um and this is not Solitaire. So I was recently on a trip to Colorado Springs to visit with my brother-in-law because they had a COVID baby, right? So I've never met my niece before. So I was coming back, and I stopped over in St. Louis. And if you ever go to St. Louis, there's the physical miniature market, right? So of course, miniature market. So they have tons and tons of games, and sitting in the very front of the store was this game called Catapult Feud, which I think is also confusingly called Catapult Kingdoms in some places. I don't, something like that. I don't know. I don't really understand it, but if you go to BGG, you Google Catapult Feud, it'll come up with a different name. But did you ever play like the old crossbows and catapults where you're just literally like shooting stuff at each other's castles?
No, but that sounds really fun.
So here's the thing. So my wife and my son walked into the store with me. I was meeting somebody else. We're going to actually have a war game night. And so they just walked in, and it's brilliant, the setup, because you walk in and they've got it set up in the front of the store so you can't not play it. And as soon as you flick the catapult for the very first time and throw a ball across the table and smash another person's thing, you're like, well, I guess I'm buying this game. So so yeah, I'm playing like a 10-year-old's dexterity game is what I've been playing most recently with my son. What I feel like there's a really good game that I recently bought that's like slightly more substantive, and I can't remember.
But
I've
you
been
know
on
what? I
vacation
think
for like 3 weeks straight, so like I haven't played any games.
your heart has been stolen by the catapult game, and that is 100% okay.
So everybody go out and look for Catapult Feud and get it. If you have kids, it's the ultimate purchase. Or
This
if you're a
sounds
kid
kind
at
of good.
heart.
Would my high schoolers like this? It sounds like they
Yeah,
would.
absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Ooh,
And
I think we need
like,
this.
and it was like $30 at Miniature Market, so it's not too
Oh
expensive.
man. So Miniature Market does not sponsor this podcast, but but they could. Oh man! And then where can we find you online?
Oh, I am probably the easiest thing is on Twitter, and my Twitter is djackthompson.
Fantastic. And those of you who are listening to this podcast probably know I'm everywhere on the internet as Beyond Solitaire. Thank you so much for listening. Leave us a like, a comment, and happy gaming, everybody.